Hello and welcome. We're the Lost Boys. I'm Tandy, joined by Harlan. Say hi, Harlan.
Hi, Harlan.
And we are doing a full set review of Disney's Lorcana's Chapter 2, Rise of the Floodborn. If you missed it, we recently did a full set review for the color Amber, and in today's video, we're going to be doing the full set of Amethyst cards, and we're going to be starting from cheapest to most expensive on ink cost. And let's just go ahead and get right into it. First up, we're going to be talking about Chip the Teacup, Gentle Soul. This is a 1-cost 2/2. This is a goon. What do you think about this one, Harlan?
I think it is a goon, so it will see some play. I think Archimedes is a mediocre character, so Chip is going to immediately get slotted in ahead of Archimedes. And this card potentially has a bright future, whether it gets a big shifter or not.
Yeah, I think it's important to always be looking at characters that you think are important enough in their stories to gain a shift. Chip the Teacup, probably not, but there's always some magic to be had, and we could see a giant Chip the Teacup come down. But for the most part, this is just another one of the goons, and these are important for deck building and for generating sealed decks and stuff, as well as starter decks. But overall, I think relatively weak. Next up, we're going to be talking about I'm Stuck. This is a 1-cost action featuring Winnie the Pooh. It is inkable, and it says choose an exotic character can't ready at the start of their next turn.
Yeah, we've talked about this card previously on some other episodes of the podcast. As we've seen more cards that are just good, I think this card has fallen further and further outside of the realm of, being a starter in some decks. I could see it every once in a while, but it's definitely not a card that I'm going to have on my radar very often.
Yeah, it's battling pretty hard with Befuddle in that slot for being utility, and I think that Amethyst having the broom trick with Befuddle to make sure they never deck out is just better.
Mm-hmm.
Next up is Croquet Mallet. This is a 1-cost uninkable item, and the ability is called Hurtling Hedgehog, and it says banish this item. Chosen character gains rush this turn. This is something that I've been looking forward to seeing, a 1-cost item that can be, essentially sacrificed to give something rush. What do you think about this one?
This card intrigues me a lot as somebody who's played a lot with Pocket Watch, where, you don't necessarily need Pocket Watch to be this late game engine with your Mickey Mouse Sorcerer and your Broom package. You just want to give your thing like a Tinkerbell Giant Fairy rush for a turn and just dumpster your opponent that turn. And this is, the type of card that could maybe be that thing. It does suck that it's uninkable, so you really don't want to play a lot of them. But, when you draw it, it's really easy to fit on curve with the thing because this would have cost what the Pocket Watch activation was anyway.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's always interesting to compare something that is playable and has a similar effect. And we all know that Pocket Watch is great in the Ruby Amethyst late game, doing things with Heroic Outlaw. Croquet Mallet is a one-shot, but from my experience, using that effect one time is often enough to gain a significant advantage. And so now it's going to be looking at whether or not Croquet Mallet can find more things that work with it other than just the ability itself. There's all sorts of things like Maurice from Sapphire that draw a card when you play an item. That type of an effect is something that you really want to look at when you are identifying homes for Croquet Mallet. Next up, we're going to be doing Blue Fairy. This is a 2-cost inkable 1/1 that quests for 1. It has evasive. That's important. The ability is called Ethereal Glow. And it says whenever you play a Floodborn character, you may draw a card. Wow.
Yeah, so I'm not sure this card is necessarily like the build around me kind of card. I think where this card really slots in is, a slightly aggressive Amethyst deck that would want to play this type of card or Pascal anyway, and happens to have a bunch of Floodborn characters.
Right.
That's where really I see a good home for this card because, building around just Floodborn characters, while that's cool and fun, it usually doesn't lead to having a super competitive, I'm going to win the tournament deck. But, playing a good aggressive deck that then has a bunch of characters, say you have 4 good characters, so 16 copies of a card that, you're going to draw a card when it comes into play. That's awesome, especially whenever you draw 2 blue fairies, then you're drawing 2. That is an incredibly strong engine, and this card could be very good as a result.
Oh, I agree. This is essentially a focal point card where if we ever get enough 1, 2, and 3 cost, Floodborn characters that are in Amethyst and one other color that you're pairing with it, it's an engine that is hard to stop because it has evasive, so it's questing in the meantime. And without direct removal, some colors just don't even have removal that can kill this thing outside of things that cost 5 or more. And so I think that Blue Fairy looks pretty great. I'm just curious why Blue Fairy is in Amethyst and not Sapphire. Blue Fairy. All right.
Flavor fail.
Next up is a new version of Hee. Is a 2 cost, inkable, 2/1. That's a weird stat line. The quest for 1. The ability is he's back. When this character is banished in a challenge, return this card to your hand. Guess what? You can never kill him. Sorry.
Todd, I'm going to need you to read the tongue twister you intentionally skipped over, please.
What's that?
Persistent Presence.
It says Persistent Presence.
All right, you got it.
Okay.
Yeah, I love this card. I'm probably going to be putting these in a lot of Amethyst decks, even though I shouldn't be. Moana is my favorite movie. Hey Hey is an amazing character, and this card is not only sweet, but actually pretty good. It's probably just not quite good enough, but that's not going to stop me.
Not quite good enough. Okay, first of all, this thing never dies, right? It comes back to your hand. It's very cheap. It's inkable. It has 2 strengths, so when your opponent challenges, it's actually hurting their thing, even if it has higher willpower. I don't know, man. I've seen a lot of aggressive Amethyst decks that want something exactly like this, so I'm going to say that I think this card's going to be good.
Yeah, the thing I think holding it back is actually like Tinkerbell Giant Fairy and Grab Your Sword, which are already kind of the things you're weak to. This card is very good against a deck like, Amber Sapphire that basically has to be clearing your characters via challenges. But the thing that usually holds these aggro decks back is actually the things that aren't actually killing your characters in challenges. And Hey Hey is very weak to that, while also not putting up a huge threat on the table. So, I'm going to play a lot with it. I hope it's great.
Next up, 2 cost Jiminy Cricket, Pinocchio's Conscience. This is a 1/2, the quest for 1, and it's inkable. It also has evasive. I think there's a big push for evasive in this set. And it says that still small voice. When you play this character, if you have a character named Pinocchio in play, you may draw a card.
Love it. I expect to be playing a lot of Pinocchios, and Jiminy Cricket has, a great stat line where he is a cheap evasive threat, and a lot of times he's going to draw a card. That is a lot of boxes to check.
Yeah, I mean, depending on how good the Pinocchios are, will greatly affect how good this card is, but we'll get to them in a minute, but the Pinocchios actually look quite nice. So next up, we're going to be talking about Cusco Wanted Llama. This is a 2 cost inkable 1/2, the quest for 1, with the ability, okay, where am I? When this character is banished, you may draw a card.
Yeah, so it's funny. We're seeing so much tension in like the 2-drop slot in these Amethyst decks, where, I think this card is also pretty good in that it just comes down and, it provides a little bit of pressure, not very much, but, it's reminiscent to me of like a Grammatala in a deck that kind of wants that type of effect more, where this card is good against those cards like Tinkerbell Giant Fairy, Grab Your Sword, and Be Prepared. Unlike Hey Hey.
In Magic, we have a subclass of card that's basically you want to be sacrificing it to do cool abilities. And Cusco Wanted Llama is one of the first few characters that I can recall where you actively want to sacrifice this to something. And so, at some point, I'm sure we'll get a couple of removal spells that are like spend this amount of ink, sacrifice a character, destroy a bigger character or whatever. And Cusco fits into that mold perfectly. The only thing that I think would fit better is something that would return itself to play immediately so that it can fuel that type of thing multiple times. But overall, Cusco quite good. And, obviously reminiscent of the Hey Hey we did talk about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Next up, the first iteration of Madam Mim. This is the Snake. 2 cost 3/3 inkable. Quest for 1 with the ability Just You Wait. When you play this character, banish her or return another chosen character of yours to your hand. So when you play this, it dies unless you return another character in your hand.
Yeah, this is a great card to be returning Jiminy Cricket with, right?
Right.
And then as long as you can keep a Pinocchio in play, basically your Madam Mim is like generating advantage where it's, maybe protecting your Jiminy Cricket from their larger evasive character and drawing you a card while playing to the board. That's really good.
Yeah, I think that the 3/3 stat line is going to be great against things like Protective Cub Simba that dominated in those early aggressive decks in Chapter 1 Constructed. And, the fact that it can bounce something means that we're just going to be looking for things that are good to bounce. And we already have a couple, and we're going to get a lot more than likely. Next up, we're going to be talking about the first iteration of Merlin. This one's the Squirrel. 2-cost inkable, 2/1, quest for 1, with the ability look before you leap. When you play this character and when he leaves play, look at the top card of your deck. Put it on either the top or the bottom of your deck. What do you think about this one?
Yeah, I think this card is pretty cool. I think it's going to be kind of pushed out by the just sheer volume of good 2-drops we have in Amethyst, especially when you're looking to pair with the second color. But, this is a pretty good ability for, setting up your next couple turns, which is really important in aggressive decks. So, I wouldn't completely count it out, but, I think it's going to be on the outside looking in.
Yeah, I mean, it is a Merlin, and Merlin could get some big shifts later, and this is the cheapest of the bunch, but I agree. We have a ton of 2s that are just better than this in the set that we've already looked at. I think He's better. Jiminy Cricket's likely better if we're going the aggressive route. And if we're going more of the attrition route, the Cusco's better as well. So just not really a great home for the Merlin, and the stats aren't really anything to write home about either. Card manipulation, I think, is overvalued right now in the game's engine. A lot of the cards that either look at the top and can put them on the bottom or into your discard pile are often a little more expensive than what I would think would be worth considering to put in your deck, and this Merlin definitely fits that bill where it's just not remotely close to good enough, if you ask me.
Mm-hmm.
Next up, maybe the best card in the set. This is a very scary one. This is Pinocchio Star Attraction. This is a 2-cost, non-inkable, 1/1, very, very tiny, but a quest for 3. 3!
That's a lot early. I certainly would not call this the best card in the set, but I also think everybody will be surprised by what I think is the best card in the set once we get to it. But this card is very strong. I think this, as I've said before, will have a huge impact on the metagame, whether it is seeing play or not. And I think its seeing play is actually going to be dictated by how much influence it is having on the metagame. Where when people are respecting it, it's not very good and you actually shouldn't be playing it. And whenever people are not respecting it, it's going to be the best thing to be doing.
Well, all I know is if you put this into an Amethyst Amber aggro deck, you have Lilo making a wish. You have Maleficent biding her time. And now Pinocchio questing for 3. This is a lot of lore generation for a very small ink investment. And if you have some protective elements with Bodyguard, like Protective Cub, some decks just fold on the spot on turn 3, I think.
Yeah, one thing I'm excited for is I think we might get to a point now with this second chapter that people start to realize how expensive a 7-drop really is, right? Because there are actual aggressive decks that aren't just trying to, curve up to 5 and 6 with you. They're just trying to get you dead without playing a 4-drop.
Yeah, not to sound like too much of a boomer, but in Magic, when I first started playing, cards were relatively weak, all things considered, or at the very least, the synergy between cards was not what it is now. It was way more about assembling like a 5-card combo to do something really powerful, or you just play something that was really expensive that was powerful as a standalone. Nowadays, in Magic specifically, there are cards that cost 2, 3, 4 that do the equivalent or better than things that used to cost 7, 8, 9. And that type of power creep is hard to keep up with. But like you said in Chapter 1, 7-drops, very good and playable. Carefree Surfer, one of the better cards. Basically every deck able to play 7-drops without much fear of dying before they get to. And now, like you said, maybe that's not the case.
Absolutely.
Next up, Pinocchio Talkative Puppet. This is the next iteration of Pinocchio. This is another 2-cost, uninkable. Weird that they would put 2 different Pinocchios at 2 costs and both be uninkable. This one's much weaker in terms of lore generation, but it has a cool ability. It's a 1/1 that quests for 1, and the ability is Telling Lies. When you play this character, you may exert chosen opposing character. So, a nice little ability comes down and exerts your opponent's thing so you can challenge it.
Yeah, I think this card is really cool. I think this card probably was inkable at one point in its life and probably still needed to be, but also was too good at inkable. I think this card is probably not going to be making the cut just because there are so many good 2s and the vast majority of them are inkable. But this card, whenever you are like, oh man, I really just keep losing because I can't kill their last thing and then turn the corner, this is a card you can look to now.
Yeah. We've seen this ability on the 3-cost Elsa that can exert itself to an exert opposing character. This can work the turn you play it, so it works in conjunction with things like support really nicely. So I would say that the 2 Pinocchios are definitely at odds in what they're trying to do. One is trying to quest for high lore, the other is trying to be a little more interactive. I think that the one that quests for 3 is significantly stronger in terms of what Amethyst is trying to do most of the time, but certainly a viable option is the one that taps things. Next up, Legend of the Sword and the Stone. This is the 2-cost inkable song from Amethyst, and it says, chosen character gains Challenger 3 this turn.
Hooray! No, yeah, exactly. Challenger is good in that it's a defensive ability, but Amethyst is not looking like a defensive color these days.
It does look like a color that has a ton of small characters. And if a ton of small characters all are squishy, like they come back, they draw a card, they do something, that is where I want to be using characters with support. And Challenger, giving something Challenger is very similar to giving them support. And so I think that this type of effect is maybe wanted, but not on a one-shot effect and not as a spell that is minus a card.
Mm-hmm.
Next up, Perplexing Signpost. This is an item, 2-cost, uninkable. The ability to Wonderland. Banish this item. Return chosen character of yours to your hand. So, pretty similar to the one we saw in Amber last time that was returning things with support, but this is a one-shot. It's a little bit cheaper, though.
Yeah, so I think this card is going to live and die by what you're trying to pick up with it. Where if you're trying to do something that is, a pretty cheap card that you're not trying to replay immediately, this card is not going to be for you. Where if you're trying to do this with like a 5-drop, this card is going to be great and exactly what you're looking for because you can pay the 2 ahead of time and then pick up your 5-drop and replay it immediately. And you don't need to do both in the same turn, like pay both costs in the same turn.
Right.
But, typically, unless you're trying to do something crazy like that, the Madam Mim is going to be a lot better because you can just do it all in one turn with, cheap cards.
All right, next up, this is one of the bigger rares in the set. This is Arthur, Wizard's Apprentice. This is a 3-cost, not inkable, 1/3 that quests for 1. And the ability is called Student. When this character quests, you may return another chosen character of yours to your hand and gain 2 lore.
I think this card is incredible. It effectively quests for 3 and, protects another character. So it's almost like a bodyguard in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Or, if you have Jiminy Cricket, you might be able to be comboing off and getting, your lore out of your Jiminy Cricket, your 2 lore extra out of this Arthur, and then another card out of the Jiminy Cricket if you have extra ink laying around for the turn. This card, is going to be like a bread and butter option in the Amethyst aggro decks.
Yeah, one thing I want to stress is I played against my boy Taryn Huck out of Apex Gaming in some fun games. He was playing his Amber Amethyst deck that we've played on our Versus series before. And one thing that he did that surprised me early on in our playing of Lorcana and learning the game is he used a Befuddle to return a Lilo making a wish to his hand and then replayed it, which essentially just gave it vigilance, right? It could quest and then readied itself for just 1 mana. Or sorry, 1 cost. And basically what that did was just like protect it from me being able to challenge it. And when you combine that with things that have bodyguard and some cheap spot removal spells, maybe it becomes much easier to keep these smaller characters around for longer, the quest for high lore. And I could easily see Arthur Wizard's Apprentice being that card that just like gives you not only a burst of lore generation when you activate it, but also protects something that also generates high amounts of lore, like the 2-cost Pinocchio. And it's going to be pretty good. All right. Next up, Fairy Godmother, Pure Heart. 3-cost Inkable, 3/4, quest for 1. The ability, just leave it to me. Whenever you play a character named Cinderella, you may exert chosen character.
Yeah, so this is another one of those, defensive cards from Amethyst where you're caring about controlling the board versus, getting your opponent dead. It'll be interesting to see this. This card, I think, will be really important for Amber Amethyst, mid-range decks where there's no... We did just get now some, direct targeted removal in those colors. But previously, the only way for Amber Amethyst to remove a character was via a challenge. And so these cards that can exert your opponent's stuff are really important for being able to remove your opponent's characters. Because, as they get higher on lore counts, you might have to kill a ready character or lose the game. And, this helps you do that.
Look, I was already putting the wardrobe in a few of my decks just to see if a 3-cost 3/4 body was any good. It was fine, and now we have one that has an ability.
Oh man, pour one out for my boy the wardrobe.
Your boy. All right. Next up, we're gonna have the next iteration of Madam Mim. This one's the Fox. 3-cost Inkable, 4/3. The quest for 1. That's a pretty good stat line. Chasing the Rabbit. When you play this character, banish her or return another chosen character of yours to your hand. So you're seeing this Mim's ability is a gate mechanic where you have to return something of yours back to your hand. And it can't be the Mims itself in order to prevent, I would assume, some sort of like bounce your own thing a million times combo that might happen in the future. And it has Rush, so it can challenge on the turn you play it. People talked about this straight up replacing Rafiki in a lot of decks. I don't agree. I think Rafiki not needing to play 1 and 2 drop characters makes it superior as a defensive measure. But this Madam Mim being able to bounce something and having the ability to be big and challenge things kind of makes it work well in your Amethyst aggressive decks as your like one piece of defensive tech.
Yeah, so I think Rafiki on the whole is a better card and we'll see probably more overall play. But this card is a slam dunk inclusion for the Amethyst aggro decks because you do get that upside of protecting your Lilo, Making a Wish, and cards similar in your archetype. And a huge issue for those decks was they needed to play a card like Rafiki to have some anti-aggro plans in their aggressive deck. But the huge cost was, those early lore generators that are undercosted are all uninkable, and so is Rafiki. So you were just hitting the ceiling on your uninkables really early on in your deck building without getting any like really high power level for the mid and late game. And Madam Mim fixes that, where now you have this kind of, it's almost additional upside on your Rafiki with a better stat line, and it's inkable.
Yeah. Next up is the counterpart for this iteration of Madam Mims, and that's Merlin Crab. This form is a 3-cost inkable, 3/3, the quest for 1. Pretty good stats. Ready or not, when you play this character and when he leaves play, chosen character gains Challenger 3 this turn. So adds into that really defensive nature that they're trying to play here. It's almost like they have two sides of the color at odds with each other. One that's trying to quest for high amounts of lore, and another which is trying to exert things and challenge them.
Yeah, I was just noticing that exact same, synergy and dyssynergy that you were pointing out. And I noticed that they're actually doing it with Merlin and Mims.
Yeah.
Where it's like, they're like the two leaders of the color almost.
Well,
I think this card is pretty sweet.
It's more like a snapshot of the movie that they're from, because I believe it's Sword in the Stone. They meet in the forest, and they're like showing how powerful they are by turning into these characters. And Merlin's like, I'll turn into this thing and show you how strong I am, or how I'm so fast I can run away. And then Madame Mim's is like, nah, I'm going to get you. I'm going to get you. And this iteration of the crab, it's going to come down and be nice to like be a challenger. But it's clear that like the Merlin cards go into a certain deck and the Mims cards go into a different type of deck. Next up is Yzma without Beauty Sleep. This is another 3-cost 3/4 the quest for 1. Nothing to see here.
Poor wardrobe.
Yeah.
That's all I got to say.
Yeah, Yzma.
I will say Yzma is good for shifting where wardrobe is not.
We're getting to that. What to me? Okay, until recently I had never watched Emperor's New Groove, and to be quite frank, I turned it off after about 30 minutes because David Spade's pop culture jokes just like aged very poorly.
Oh yeah,
like,
that makes sense.
So there's this thing that happens in in media, I guess, specifically in fiction, where the characters can act like they would act in their setting, or they can act like I would act in that setting, considering my life experiences. And all of my jokes would just go over everyone's head because they don't know the things I'm referencing. And so in Aladdin, for example, the genie does that a lot. And it would be more annoying if the genie wasn't literally creating them as he's doing them as a joke. Whereas in some of the other Disney movies, they just make jokes that are pop culture references to our world. And it just doesn't make any sense. And the third or fourth time David Spade did it, I was just like, I don't want to do this anymore. This is just like not that fun. Anyway, but Yzma is the antagonist of the movie, and there is a big shift one that we're coming up on soon here. But next up, we're going to move on to this Gruesome and Grim. This is an action, and it's a song, and it costs 3, and it's not inkable. And it says, play a character with cost 4 or less for free. They gain Rush. At the end of the turn, banish them. What you think?
I think it's a sweet card that, as time goes, it's going to be a card to keep your eye on for, hey, this might be busted in the future. But right now, I don't see it.
This is like just in time, but slightly more restrictive, and the character dies. I despise this card.
Yeah, it's not even like you're going to get like great pressure because the character can't quest. So it's like a bad removal spell. What's going to be really the thing that people have to figure out is there any character that costs 4 or less that when it dies, it does something outrageous? And if you pair this with like the 1-cost Cinderella Singer, you can sing Gruesome and Grim on turn 2, and then that allows you to put something in play that costs 4, and then it'll die during the end of turn. Now, in Magic, we have something called Footsteps of the Goryo, which is very similar to this, where it brings something back from the graveyard for 1 turn cycle, and then at the end of the turn, it sacrifices itself and dies again. And so you pair that with things that have incredible abilities when they go to the graveyard, or when they're sacrificed, or whatever. And Gruesome and Grim just reminds me a little bit of that. But until they make like a 4-drop that says when it dies, draw 6 cards and put a big character from your hand into play, Gruesome and Grim ain't it. Not only does it die at the end of turn, but it also gains Rush, not the ability to quest. So just miss me with this piece of crap. All right. Next up, Sorcerer Spellbook. 3 costs, non-inkable, has the ability Knowledge. Exert it and pay 1 ink to gain 1 lore. Todd, I got good news.
What?
You probably don't have to watch Ruby Amethyst Mirrors Going to Time anymore.
You think they're all going to play one of this, or do you think this is going to be like a 4 of?
I hope so if they keep playing the deck. I don't think it's going to be a 4 of. I think, 1, maybe 2, because it is, for select matchups. But I am happy for, smooth of the ease of tournaments, not going to time every round.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm happy to see this card.
The stronger the cards get, right, the more quickly they're able to end the game. And as you continue to make 200 cards every 3 months, you're going to start to see some really interesting ways to win the game. And I think that this is just one of them, and I'm hoping that it's good, but it's kind of expensive, and it's not inkable. If it was inkable, it would be 100% 4 of in a lot of Amethyst decks, very strong. Not inkable makes that a slightly different story, I think. Next up, a not as exciting card. This is one of my favorite characters, Dr. Facilier. This is the Savvy Opportunist. 4 cost, inkable, 4/2, the quest for 1, and it has evasive.
So I think this card actually has some potential, being, a kind of a side shift to Pongo, or not Pongo, Jetsam. Jetsam, that's the one. Where, this is an evasive body that is better defensively at challenging something like Goofy that's a 3/4 evasive, where, this can actually trade off and acts as, pseudo removal for that type of effect. And, we have a big Facilier to shift on top of this. And the thing holding that Facilier back in my mind, because that card is kind of absurd, is that it didn't have an actually good body to shift onto, where this body still isn't like actually good, but is much more passable than the 2 we've had previously.
Yeah. Next up, Elsa Gloves Off. 4 cost inkable, 3/4, quest for 1, and has Challenger +3. So when it challenges, it's got 6 power, or 6 strength rather. What do you think about this one?
I think it's like a solid role player you might play 1 or 2 of in your Elsa Spirit of Winter decks, where it's early removal essentially and gives you a shift target, but nothing to write home about.
Yeah, anything that has Challenger to me really needs to be compared to Hook, Forceful Duelist, and Prince Eric. These steel cards are essentially the top of their class in terms of how they can challenge early on and how they trade up early on. And Elsa Gloves Off is a 4 cost character that can trade up into like a 6 drop or whatever. But like, that's not really what I'm in the mood for on a 4 drop. I want something that does high impact, turns the corner, makes your opponent really just like, and this is not it. Your opponent can basically ignore this card. It only quests for 1.
Honestly, that's something we could talk on briefly anyway. Is just in general, 4 drops are actually in a really weird spot in Lorcana, where if you look at a bunch of deck lists, there aren't actually good 4 drops in any decks. All the 4 drops occupy this really weird space where they get kind of sat on by the 5 drops, because all the 5 drops are really good, and the shift characters that, for the most part cost 4 when they're shifted. So these 4 drops are actually in this weird kind of bubble where they're better than the 3 drops, but like they're not actually better on rate than the other things that can happen. But I think that Elsa actually is in a unique space where she does trade up, and she threatens to trade with a Tinkerbell Giant Fairy or eat a Stitch Rockstar and survive. She actually threatens to do these powerful things while being a reasonable body, and might actually see some play as a result.
All right, moving on. This is the next iteration of Merlin. This one's the GOAT. 4 cost, 4/3, inkable, quest for 1, and the ability is Here I Come. When you play this character and when he leaves play, gain a lore. This is my pick for one of the top 5 cards in the set.
On an uncommon?
I mean, the ability... Okay, first of all, gain a lore when it comes into play is excellent. That's just an excellent ability. If it had no other abilities, that would be good enough. But when your opponent challenges it and banishes it, you get a lore. When you bounce it, you get a lore. And if you bounce it and can replay it with their Mims effects, then you're able to essentially burn your opponent out from a much lower starting lore total than you might normally be able to. Mm-hmm. And it's going to just pressure your opponent in spots where they just might not be able to do anything about it. And it's just a unique effect that we just don't have. And so I just think it's an excellent aggressive card.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think I would have it in my top 5, but I do think this is just a slam dunk auto include for every aggressive Amethyst deck. Should just have 4 of these, which is also kind of weird because I just talked about the weird spot that 4 drops are in and that we didn't really have any good ones, but
well, now we do. Yeah. Next up, another 4-drop Merlin. This one's the Rabbit. This one is 4 costs, uninkable, 2/3 quest for 1 with the ability Hoppity Hip. When you play this character and when he leaves play, you may draw a card. So similar to the GOAT, but instead of lore, it's card draw, not inkable, smaller stats. Tell me about it.
Yeah, I think this card is in a weird place because it's not what you want in the aggressive decks, because you don't want a bunch of 4s. And we just talked about Merlin Goat, which is going to be like an auto include in the aggressive decks at 4 and is inkable. And, this card isn't really what you want in a control deck either, because the control decks don't want to invest their uninkables into something so low impact. They need big things like Ursula and Elsa, Spirit of Winter. So I think this card, if it's going to find a home, is actually going to be in the more mid-rangey decks that, need to play to the board, trade off in challenges, and then get underneath the control decks a bit. And this card does all of those things pretty well. So, if we're going to see this card, that's where it's going to be in my mind. And I do think the card's pretty good. It threatens to draw. It gets one card, and then it's going to get a second card at some point in the game.
Right. Next up, another iteration of Merlin. This is the Shapeshifter, his original form. 4-cost inkable, 1/5 that quests for 1, with the ability Battle of Wits. Whenever one of your other characters is returned to your hand from play, this character gets +1 lore generation this turn. So, with all those Mims abilities, with the Christopher Robin that returns something to your hand. Is it Christopher Robin? No, I'm sorry. It was Prince Arthur? Which one returned? Prince Arthur returned. Arthur returns the things to your hand. Right. Okay. Mm-hmm. So Merlin here threatens to gain extra lore. 1/5 stats, quest for 1. Not that exciting on the front of it.
Yeah, I think this card is really just a pipe dream. Like, this is a sweet, fun theme deck. I do not think it's going to be of like the density of power level that it's going to need to be like a competitive mainstream. But it's a sweet card, and it'll definitely be super fun if you're doing like sealed or draft, and you get this early and can like really build around it. That's where it's going to really shine.
Yeah, I think it's one of those cards where it has enough willpower where it might actually be able to quest twice. And so one turn, you bounce a thing, you quest for 2. Another turn, you bounce a thing, you quest for 2 again. That's really where you're going to see it do some really cool stuff. But in the future, I foresee having more things that can return to your hand. And so, that might just make him some sort of extra powerful finisher in a deck that caps out at 4. And that's something that's relatively exciting to me. Next up, this is Peter Pan's Shadow, Not Sewn On. 4-cost, non-inkable, 2/3, quest for 2. Has evasive, great stat so far. Has rush, that's pretty cool. And it says your other characters with rush gain evasive. So your rush characters like Maui can challenge things that have evasive.
Yeah, so I think this card is ultimately going to be held back by the fact that it's uninkable, which, that is already a pretty big barrier to clear. So, it's already fighting for spots in a deck, and then couple that with how this card is being wanted to be played is at tension with Simba Protective Cub, where this card really wants to come down, eat a small character, and then just quest the rest of the game. Mm-hmm. Right? And Simba Protective Cub immediately puts a wrench in that plan.
That's true. I think that, obviously Protective Cub is like the marquee aggressive card for Amber. But I think over time, there's going to be other aggressive decks that don't play Amber, and Peter Pan's Shadow being a 2/3 with Rush that has evasive means that being able to challenge something and then not being able to be finished off on the way back. Definitely very cool. Maybe Peter Pan's Shadow pairs nicely with, Hook Forceful Duelist, for example. And so you have things like Hook Duelist and Prince Eric on 2 that allow you to challenge Simba so that when you do actually get to play the Pan's Shadow, it can do some serious work. But I don't see this being better than either of the Merlins that cost 4, the Rabbit, or the one that gains lore when you play it and when it leaves play. So an interesting card. We'll see. I mean, it is one of the bigger rares in the set, so maybe we're wrong. It's always good to have a one opinion on something, but be open to changing it when you have more context and when you actually get to play with the cards some. Next up, we're moving on to Binding Contract. This is a 4-cost item, non-inkable. It says for all eternity, exert it and then exert one of your characters. To exert another chosen character. A lot of exerting going on, but it's like tap 2 things to tap a thing.
Yeah, so I think this card is probably not going to see much play just because it is uninkable, but it does add that element that we were talking about before where, Amethyst decks can struggle when they don't have access to direct removal and your opponent is close to winning and they just keep playing these big characters late in the game. You got to exert them to get them down. And if that is a problem you find yourself in and having regularly, this might be a card to look forward to, But I would probably just put more Elsa Spirit of Winter in my deck.
Yeah, for sure.
And if that's not enough, I don't know what's going to help you.
All right, next up, Fairy Godmother here to help. This is a 5-cost inkable, 3/7, the quest for 2. No abilities, but some pretty good stats. 3/7, questing for 2. It's quite large.
Yeah, I don't know if this stat line is quite good enough. People made fun of me for playing Maleficent Uninvited, and that card is great. But
quest for 3.
Really, yeah, exactly. The third point of lore is really the selling point on that card, and people were already, like, are you sure that's good enough? And, the extra point of willpower does not make up for an extra point of lore. I tell you that.
No, it doesn't. All right, moving on. This is another iteration of Fairy Godmother. This one might be pretty good. This one's ultra rare. Fairy Godmother Mystic Armorer, a 5-cost inkable, 3/4, quest for 2, has shift for 2, and we do know that there's a smaller Fairy Godmother, I think. It says, forget the coach, here's a sword. Whenever this character quests, your characters gain Challenger 3, and when this character is banished in a challenge, return this card to your hand this turn. So, long story short, once you quest with Fairy Godmother, all your stuff challenges +3, and you get the Dr. Facilia ability where they come back to your hand. If your opponent taps out and quests a bunch and leaves themselves vulnerable, Fairy Godmother can come down and obliterate their board position.
Yeah, so what I foresee happening, and it's going to happen like twice ever to somebody, and then they're just, as soon as there's the smaller Fairy Godmother in play, they're just not going to quest. Because what's going to happen is they're going to shift this Fairy Godmother onto their smaller one, quest with it, everything's going to get Challenger, murder all their stuff, and then they're going to play one of the cards that picks up their Fairy Godmother, and it'll pick up both of them. And then they're going to have like 10 cards in hand, and you're not going to have a board, and you're going to be dead.
Yeah, very cool card is Fairy Godmother Mystic Armorer. It'll be interesting to see how it turns out. Moving on, this is another iteration of Madame Mim. This is the rival of Merlin, her human form. 5-cost, inkable, 2/5, has shift 3, and the ability is Gruesome and Grim. You exert it to play a character with cost 4 or less for free. They gain rush, and at the end of turn, banish them. This is the activated ability version of the other card we just talked about. This costs 5 and is inkable. The song we were talking about costs 3 and is not inkable. I think this card's awesome, but mostly because it's a repeatable effect and the card itself is inkable.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think this card, it's one you have to play with, really, to truly understand how powerful it is. And if it's just, oh, yeah, I use it once and then it gets challenged off the board because it's a 2/5, this isn't going to be that great. But, it shifts pretty early, so you can get an early advantage. There's a ton of things you can put in that, they get a trigger when they come in, and when they leave, you can get a lot of good effects and uses out of this. And, if your thing is coming in and rushing and just banishing anyway, the banish them downside isn't even relevant. This is a card that could be very powerful, and I'm excited to play with it and find out.
Next up, Pinocchio on the Run. This is a 5-cost uninkable 3/3, the quest for 2, has shift 3, and has the ability listen to your conscience. When you play this character, you may return chosen character or item with cost 3 or less to their player's hand. So this thing comes in, bounces an opposing small character or item, and with that shift, it can be relatively cheap and a quest for 2. I like this card quite a bit, but I don't see myself shifting with it too much because one of the Pinocchios is rather weak in my opinion, and the other one quests for 3. And unless you desperately need to bounce something, I think that you're going to leave that one that quests for 3 on the table quite a bit. But 5-cost bounce something is pretty good.
Yeah, so I think that's a weird tension that we haven't seen very much with the way Chapter 1 was constructed with all the shift cards, which we just saw actually with Fairy Godmother too. She shifts onto a 3-cost 3/4 that quests for 1, and she's a 5-cost 3/4 that quests for 2. So like you're not really upgrading your stats very much. Where this Pinocchio, you're beefing up your strength and your willpower, but you're actually lowering your lore in a lot of cases. And I think, what we might actually see with this is you quest for 3 with your small one, and then you shift after you've quested
I didn't think about that.
to
That's
bounce their attacker.
Yeah.
And then you're still way ahead on board because you have the 3/3 that's questing for 2, and you kind of sucked up their turn. That's the play pattern I do envision for this. What I think is actually going to be the problem is whether you're going to be wanting to put this 5-drop uninkable in your deck when, if say your Amethyst Emerald, you're going to be competing with like Cusco at 5.
Right.
That's already an uninkable. So there's going to be a lot of tension there outside of the normal tension of the card, in that you're, kind of side grading your shift instead of upgrading with it. So just something to keep in mind.
All right, next up, Winnie the Pooh, the Honey Wizard. This is a 5-cost inkable 5/5, the quest for 2. This was, I think, the first card they revealed from Rise of the Floodborn Chapter 2, and it's relatively low impact, all things considered, but it has nice stats, 5/5 for 5, and a quest for 2. What do you think about the Honey Man?
Not a very constructed power level card, unfortunately. I do love Honey, though.
I do love Honey as well. All right, this is maybe my favorite Amethyst card we'll talk about next. It's Yzma, Scary Beyond All Reason. This is a 6-cost inkable 4/4, the quest for 2. It has shift 4, so it can shift on one of the cheaper Yzmas. And Cruel Irony, when you play this character, shuffle another chosen character card into their player's deck, and that player draws 2 cards. That means you can target your own thing to draw 2, or your opponent's thing to get rid of a scary minion and allow them to draw 2. And overall, I think it's just very cheap and pretty solid, and I could definitely see myself banishing my own characters with this quite a bit just to draw 2 cards.
Yeah, this is a card that's strange and hard to evaluate, because when you're targeting your opponent's characters, right, giving them 2 cards is way too big of a downside in the vast majority of cases to really want to be doing that. So really you're looking at, how do I gain the advantage of, all right, I'm going to get rid of my character and draw 2 extra cards. And while that is very enticing, the aggressive decks aren't necessarily wanting exactly that, right? Because when you get rid of your character, it gives your opponent tempo, because they don't actually have to challenge that character that's gone now.
Right.
Which actually is, a lot of times when you're just racing anyway, worth almost a full card anyway. So this card is in a weird space for me, where I don't know how it's really going to line up in a lot of situations, and I'm excited to see it in the games to figure that out.
No, same here. This is a type of effect that's pretty rare on cards when they come down, like banish something. And so if it's cheaper than Maleficent Monstrous Dragon, it has to have a significant downside. And when you compare it to things of similar cost, Hades Infernal Schemer puts it into the Inkwell, for example. It's not inkable at 7, and so it has some significant tension with other uninkables in Sapphire, such as Mickey Mouse Detective. And in Amethyst, right, we have no removal at all. And so this is one of the first removal spells where we can play and have an Amethyst answer to a large opposing character. But if your opponent doesn't have anything worth killing, you can squish your own hee-hee. Is it hee-hee or hey-hey?
Hey-hey.
You can squish your own hey-hey. It'll come back to your hand. You'll draw 2 cards. And then, at some point, maybe this starts to look like a Amethyst Amber Stitch Rockstar deck with hey-hey, right? And that comes back to your hand a bunch. Maybe that's a way to take it. But overall, I think the card's certainly very cool. And I like that it adds a little bit of buff to the other Yzmas that exist. After seeing a little bit of Emperor's New Groove, she was very clearly the best character.
No, the best character is Krunk. You just didn't make it far enough into the movie.
Dude, he's like He's just big dumb evil. I don't like big dumb evil. I mean, maybe
He's not big dumb evil.
Well, he starts off big dumb
didn't
evil.
get far enough in the movie.
Whatever.
You go into his whole Boy Scout background. Oh
no.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
All right. Whatever. Fair play. Maybe I'll have to go finish it. All right. We get to the last card in Amethyst. This is the big baddie Madam Mim Purple Dragon. 7 cost inkable. 5/7. Quest for 4. Huge stats. Has evasive. Even huger. I win. That's the name of the ability. It says when you play this character, banish her or return another 2 chosen characters of yours to your hand. So a pretty steep cost to cast this one. Not only 7 ink, but returning 2 characters. That's kind of gross, man.
Yeah, so this card is also in a very weird place in that it looks like it would be best in aggressive decks. But the aggressive decks now really don't want to be getting up to 7 ink. So it's really going to be really good against like Sapphire decks, but then returning the characters isn't all that great against like a deck like Sapphire. And then this card, where you gravitate is like, oh, this is amazing against Be Prepared, right? Like I can play my giant threat and pick up my other threats, so they have to Be Prepared me. But then you just walk right into a Dragonfire. And then you have to spend a whole turn redeploying, and then you're going to get Be Prepared, and then you're going to spend a whole turn redeploying, and then you're going to get Elsa, and you're just going to hate yourself.
Yeah, I think it's pretty obvious that they wanted this card to be like a big focal point finisher for the Mim cycle. I think it really missed the mark. I think that returning 2 is a huge drawback. The ability is cool. Questing for 4 being a large thing that has evasive, that's nice, but when you start actually playing the games, you realize that A, you don't have 2 characters return, or B, if you return 2 characters, you're so far behind on board that you're dead. And C, this has no form of protection other than evasive, so spot removal like Dragonfire, Hades Infernal Schemer, and Maleficent Monstrous Dragon all just kind of knock this down, and they're very happy that you picked up those 2 characters. So
yeah, I think this card, granted, Ward is not in flavor for Amethyst so far that we've seen. I think this card would be probably solid to maybe very good if it had Ward, where you could insulate from a Be Prepared, and then they basically have to Be Prepared it or give you 4 lore. That I think would give this card plenty of good tension going for it instead of going against it.
All right. Well, that is going to do it for Amethyst. Before we go, I'd like to say thank you to our sponsor, Games and Comics Paradise. They're a game store out of Fairfax, Virginia. They're your one-stop shop for all things related to TCGs, from Pokemon to Yu-Gi-Oh!, Magic the Gathering, and now Disney's Lorcana. Make sure to check out gcparadise.com. Find your singles, find anything you need for your next upcoming event. Games and Comics Paradise also does regular tournaments for Disney's Lorcana, so make sure to check out their website for information on their upcoming events. I'm Tandy of the Lost Boys. That's Harlan. That's Harlan of the Lost Boys. Say bye, Harlan.
Bye, Harlan.